What is the creepiest, strangest thing that has happened to you, or a friend or family member, that creeps you out to this day? My best friend and I were having a sleepover at her house. We were teenagers, and for some reason we were home alone. We're goofing off upstairs when suddenly we hear a crash downstairs. We of course freak out for maybe 30 minutes before we get the nerve to go check it out. I grab a bat and we slowly creep down the steps. In the kitchen, we find a glass bowl had fallen and broke. But the really creepy part is that all the pieces had been picked up and put in another bowl on the table. We still have no idea how that happened. Another time with the same friend, we decided it would be fun to sleep outside in my friend's parents' camper. In the middle of the night I woke up to the silhouette of some guy standing in the doorway. He stands for a minute and then walks out. I was still half asleep and wondering if that really happened when I fell back to sleep. The next morning my friend tells me about a dream she had about someone coming into the camper. Of course, freaking out ensued. Apparently someone, a hobo perhaps, she lives right next to the tracks, had been sleeping there without anyone knowing. Okay, so I am at Walmart standing in front of the French bread. Notice this strange guy standing there, staring at the food. About 40 years old, jeans shorts, little overweight, handlebar mustache, tight shirt, flip-flops. I pick up one loaf of bread and he turns to me with a strange smile. Walk away from creeper JPEG. After a while, 30 minutes or so, I change my mind and go back to the bread aisle and that dude is still standing in the same spot, just staring. So I put the bread back. He immediately grabs it, the one I just put down, and storms to the cash register, pays and leaves. That is the only thing he bought. What the hell? Edit. Spelling. Grammar. Edit 2. Yeah, I am from Europe, but I live in California right now. I cannot make it like that up. When I was 6, 28 years ago, my mom and dad took me and my younger sister to a MLB game, leaving my grandmother to babysit my youngest sister. When we got back my grandmother told my folks that two guys had come by the house with photography equipment and asked whether a young girl with red curly hair lived there, and that they had spotted her and that she would be a great child model for some advertising work they were doing. And my grandmother said she wasn't home, they said they would come back another time. My grandmother and mom didn't think much about it, but my dad said something's not right here and called the police. 15 minutes later several FBI agents showed up and began conducting interviews with my grandmother and my parents while I ran around and showed the agents my Matchbox police helicopter. Turns out we had been targeted by a child theft ring. The photographers would take a bunch of photos and wait until the toddler threw a tantrum and the photographers would then ask the mother to go grab a toy to keep the child entertained. While the mother was out of the room, they would grab the child and bolt, leaving everything else behind. The FBI told my folks that my sister had already been sold and would have been out of the country within 24 hours if they got her. We were advised to change preschools and other aspects of our daily routine. It still gives me the chills to think about what could have happened to her. Needless to say, mom became pretty overprotective. It was a few years before she even trusted us with a babysitter. Edit. Reddit police are calling BS on my story. That's fine and I don't much care because I don't Reddit for karma. View my nearly 1 year history and posts for confirmation. I will say that certain facts may have been conveyed to me with slight exaggerations. FBI probably did not respond in 15 minutes but it was same day and during daylight hours. But it does not make the essence of the story any less true. We are just fortunate that everything worked out. TLDR. Child theft ring targeted my sister. I've told this story before. When I was 15, my stepfather got stabbed right in front of me. There was an altercation in the middle of our street at 2 in the morning that woke our whole house up. My stepfather and my uncle were still up drinking and went outside to see what was going on. There was a young man kicking the it out of one of our older neighbors, an alcoholic gentleman who lived a few houses down from us. Found out afterward the young man was dating the older man's daughter. My stepfather and uncle went out to break it up and in the commotion, my stepfather was stabbed by the guy. He stumbled back onto the porch and fell, and I tried to catch him. His blood smeared down the front of my shirt. The younger guy took off and we called 911. We were in the hospital until the early morning. When me and my mom got home there was a message on our answering machine. It was a friend of mine from school, crying and apologizing for calling in the middle of the night. But she had just had a dream that there was screaming and a fight and I was covered in blood. She begged me to call her back. The timestamp on the message was the same time as the stabbing. This is in the late 80s. Before computers and even cell phones really. I lived on the other side of town from her. There was no way she could have known what had happened. My mother was almost killed by her stalker neighbor when she was younger. Cops suspect he was hiding in the house with a kitchen knife while she was in the house. Luckily she got a creeped out feeling and ran to her grandparents' house. Edit. Okay, so since people are asking for the story, I am going to just copy paste from when I told it before. Okay, so when my mom were a youngin', her and her mother lived in a trailer in the backyard of a family member's house. My mom was about 12 at the time that the man in the neighboring house started to stare at her from time to time. She got a creepy vibe from him but figured it was just a harmless lonely guy. One night when my mom was alone, she heard something on the roof of their trailer. Then she heard what sounded like footsteps slowly walking along the metal rooftop. Given they were dirt poor at the time, they did not have a phone, so she eventually ran out of the trailer and into the house without looking on the roof. When her uncle went outside to investigate, nothing was on the roof. A few weeks went by with no incidents and my mom figured she must have been overly scared of nothing. More ducked up stuff would randomly happen, but only when she was alone. And it was always spaced out a week or two. If I remember correctly, this occurred over maybe a couple months before it stopped completely. Months go by without any weird instances at all until one night my mom wakes up to the trailer unbelievably hot. She could feel the heater on full blast. She got out of bed and was about to go to the control for the trailer's heater, but she was overcome with a bad feeling and decided to just go into the house. The uncle went out to the trailer and noticed that the lock on the door was broken or messed with, and he looked inside quickly but didn't see anything. His wife made him call the police, and when they came out they searched the trailer and found one of the kitchen knives behind a chair next to the heating controller. They suspected that the neighbor went into the trailer, turned the heat up and crouched behind the chair waiting for my mom to come by, and then who knows. It's been a long time since I heard the story, but from what I remember the cops questioned the neighbor but really couldn't do anything about it. Luckily my mom and grandmother were able to move out of that town right after that. My mom told me that about 5 or something years later she was visiting other family who lived in a nearby town and she saw the neighbor at the grocery store and she bolted out before he saw her. I worked with a lady once who was pretty old. I'd say about 70 years old. Since our job was pretty boring, we talked a lot and she had all kinds of crazy stories. But this one creeps me out still. She said when her grandma died they had her buried in a wood box in the backyard, as was pretty custom in those days. Years later they have a family plot in a cemetery and decide to dig her grandma up to move her to the family plot. She said when they took the lid off the coffin, it had claw marks all over the inside. The grandma had apparently been buried alive. I had a dog once that was super loyal and loving and would always come running to me when I called and would almost crash into me whenever I had treats for him. One day sitting in the living room, all of his hair stood up on his back and he was just staring over my shoe, growling and showing his teeth. No matter what I would do to try to get him to come to me, he would never break his stare at that one spot and just kept growling. I eventually carried him out of the room because it was freaking me and my roommates out so bad. Lived in the Hollywood Hills and this happened in the early 80s. Crazy knocking at my door at 9 PM. I go to answer the door and there's a lady there just hysterical, talking about there's so much blood. She looks normal and is dressed in clean clothing, so we let her in. She tells a story about seeing someone get stabbed. I call the police, and 2 uniformed LAPD officers arrive in 10 minutes. They take the lady away and tell us that she was reported missing, has a mental condition and lives up the street. All good. 30 minutes later, another knock at the door. 2 different cops this time, responding to the call. They have no idea who the other 2 cops were. Take our information and statements. Description of the officers and the lady as well. Radio conversations back and forth ensue, and they really don't have any idea how any other cops could have picked her up, because they were given the call 40 minutes ago. My great-grandfather awoke to a man standing in the corner of the bedroom watching him and my great-grandmother sleeping. They live out in the middle of nowhere, so they never used to lock their doors. Apparently this man had just broken out of a mental institution and walked there. My grandmother told me a story that creeps her out still. Back when my grandfather was alive, my grandmother woke up one night to hear something smash downstairs. She woke my grandfather up and made him go check it out with a baseball bat. And when he got downstairs there was a broken flower pot in the middle of their family room floor. About 20 feet from where it usually was. There was no dirt trail. It was just smashed on the floor in the middle of the room. As if someone dropped it straight down. Well, I'm late but whatever. So about 2 years ago I was in my room reading a book when I hear it. Soft as ever. 2 little girls giggling. Not just any giggle. It was the kind of giggling you hear in horror movies. I immediately put down my book and listened. After about a minute of holding my breath I decided it must have come from outside. Then that night just as I'm about to drift off to sleep, I hear it again. 2 little girls giggling. Now it was 2 AM and I was pretty damn sure there weren't 2 little girls outside my window at that time of night. So I began to freak out. I sat up in my bed and waited for what felt like forever just listening. Then I hear it again. I jumped out of my bed and go spend the rest of the night in the guest room. By the next morning I was convinced my room was haunted. For the next week I avoided my room and spent my nights in the guest room unbeknownst to my family. I was afraid to tell anyone for fear I was going crazy or they wouldn't believe me. But every time I spent more than an hour in my room I would hear those 2 little girls giggle. By the end of the week I was a mess. I could barely sleep and was terrified of my room. Then one morning my brother walks up to me and says, "You deaf or something?" Obviously I was confused and after further questioning he tells me about this small device he had placed in my room. Apparently it's like some sort of prank device that's easily hidden and can make a variety of different noises. My brother however chose the creepiest duck little girls giggling sound. He wondered why I hadn't heard it or said something about all week and I just wanted to punch him in the face. So my room wasn't haunted after all. Moral of the story. Sometimes your brother is just an asshole. We were hanging out at a friend's house playing SSBB, and suddenly my friend pauses and mutes the TV. We start listening and there comes this slow sound of a piano key being played. My friend has a wall piano. We all get close and start calling out to see if anybody is there. No response. So we decided to walk out slowly and take a look at what is making the noise. Turns out one of the mechanisms inside the piano was slipping and the old string was elongating, thus making it sound like it was being played over and over again. We had some laughs after that chilling moments. Also I won the match with Oliver. Math didn't have a chance. I have a story that didn't happen to me, but rather my friend's dad. This guy isn't the type to bullet, so I believe him 100%. My friend's dad, we'll call him Jack, and his brother, we'll call him Tom, lived with each other in the 80s. It was just the 2 of them living in the house. No one else. So, this one night Jack is coming home at night and walks into his living room to see a bunch of old people sitting around talking. As he walks in, they all just quiet down and awkwardly look at him as he walks by. He doesn't see Tom anywhere, so he just assumes Tom will be back to tend to his guests. Jack has work the next morning, so he goes in his room to get some sleep, but is kept up from all the people talking. He walks out from his room and is promptly met up with Tom, who is coming out of his room to tell Jack to keep his friends quiet. However, Jack was coming out to tell Tom to keep his friends quiet. They walk out from the hallway into the living room only to see that it's empty with a leftover smell of musk. Just a few months ago, while I was still in school, I rented an old house with 2 of my friends. I lived in the basement and they each had a room upstairs. Several strange things happened to me while I was living in that basement. The first was that I had just gotten a dog and he was about 4 months old at the time. Now and then, right when I turned the TV off to go to sleep, my dog would start whining and growling at one corner of my room. He would usually not get on my bed because he wasn't allowed, but during these times, he would jump on my bed and get as close to me as he could, all without his eyes ever leaving that corner. This happened about 5 times over the course of 4 months. Then, toward the end of the school year, when I was about to move out, the scariest thing that has ever happened to me in my life occurred. Under our stairs was a little door that led to a small space that had a dirt floor. There was also a really weird, old wooden piece of what looks like a map nailed to the inside of the door. So it's a pretty spooky place. Up until the day before this incident, we had kept a small chair in front of this door that I laid my coats and things on. But we had some friends over the night before, so we brought the chair upstairs. It was dark, probably 8 PM, and I had just been upstairs in the kitchen. I had just gotten off the stairs and was about to open the door to my room, when the door to the little closet under the stairs opened so slowly and with the loudest creak I've ever heard in my life. I stood rooted to the spot, frozen in fear, staring at the closet, waiting for whatever was about to come out of it. I literally stood there for about 5 minutes, absolutely terrified. Eventually, I opened the door to my room and locked it as fast as I could. I wasn't sure either of my roommates were home, so I called my female roommate and she was there. I spent the rest of that night upstairs with her, still too scared to go back downstairs. I should mention that I'm a 21-year-old man who does not scare easily. Now I know many of you will probably say it was the wind or the fact that I had just come down the stairs or something just as my roommates did. But I've had those things happen to me before and been kind of creeped out. But this was different. The second I heard that closet open and looked over to see it opening so slowly, I felt this sheer terror. It honestly felt like there was someone or something else in the room with me that wanted me to see that door open. If this gets any significant number of upvotes, I'm going to have my female roommate, who still lives there, go down and take a picture of the basement and the little room under the stairs. Edit 2. Guys, I texted my roommate but she wasn't at the house at the time. I'm just waiting on her to send me the pics and I will post them as soon as I can. Please stop massacring my poor inbox. Edit 3. OP delivers. Here is a link to 3 pictures of the closet. I'm sorry it took so long, but I was waiting on my roommate to send me the pics. Edit 4. The map has been confirmed as the northern part of Indiana, judging by the fact that you can clearly see Fort Wayne labeled on it. However, if anyone would like to offer up an explanation as to why there is a wooden road map nailed upside down to the inside of the door to the spooky closet under the stairs, I'm taking suggestions. I delivered newspapers in a fairly rural area the summer after I graduated high school. One night, it's pouring rain and I'm driving down this dirt road that is a dead end to a farmer's house. I've been down this road a few dozen times and know the routine. Drop the paper off in the box at the end of the drive. Whipperity. Back up the road and off to my next stop. This time, as I am getting out of my car to place the newspaper in the holder, I see this man in the ditch wearing a drenched white shirt running at me as fast as he can. He got within 20 feet of me. I could see what my mind pictured as a hatchet or axe. I had never ran so hard in my life. Edit. I ran back around the front of my car, jumped in and took off. Everything happened so fast that I almost didn't realize where I was. It must have been about 5-10 miles later that I attempted to call 911. No signal using my Motorola flip phone in the middle of nowhere in the year 2000. I had to stop at a farmer's house to call the police at 2 AM. Turns out the guy killed himself within an hour of his run with me in that wooded ditch. Edit. I had not thought about that night in a long time. Kind of rattled nerves again thinking about it. My grandfather passed away in 08. He was a big fan of opera music and would blare it in the morning if he and my grandmother ever had any grandkids sleeping over. It was a good wake-up alarm. About a week or 2 after his funeral, I was lying on my bed when I began to hear a scraping noise. I looked in the direction the sound came from to see a clock radio on the top shelf of my desk turn to face me, sliding across the desk in my direction, and it started playing all by itself. The music it was playing was opera music. There I was, a young man in a crowded Chicago bar. It was 2 AM, and I was slightly intoxicated. I had just been denied by the girl I foolishly spent the whole night talking to, and I celebrated by taking a couple more shots. Suddenly, all the alcohol I had drank that night came rushing to my bladder, so I decided to head to the bathroom before calling it a night. After stumbling through the crowd, I finally made it to the dilapidated bathroom that was located downstairs. When I walked in, I was met with a shocking sight. There, standing in the middle of the men's bathroom in a itty bar at 2 in the morning, was a topless blonde breastfeeding what looked like a newborn babe. Whether I was too drunk, or just in shock at what I was seeing. I couldn't seem to move or speak. The silence was broken when the woman, clearly appalled that I was staring, yelled, "Do you mind?" and proceeded to squirt her breast milk at my face. The woman's attempt to hit me was successful. Without saying a word, drunkenly thinking I was somehow in the wrong, I walked out of the bathroom, wiped the breast milk from my face, and exited the bar. Since it all happened so fast, it wasn't until the next morning that I was able to process the absurdity of what had happened the night before. This happened to my friend. She told me that when she was little she was playing with her little brother and sister one night. Her little brother looked out the window and said, "Who is that man?" They all went to the window to see what he was talking about. She said there was a white figure sitting on top of the telephone pole. Looked like a man. He was staring at them with a huge creepy smile. Then he just stood up and jumped off the pole and simply vanished before they saw him hit the ground. She said it scared them so much. Her sister won't even talk about it. This whole thing was probably just a coincidence, but it still freaks me out. I was waiting at the bus stop around 2 years ago and just start chatting with this lady who was waiting for a different bus. It was just a normal conversation, but there was an odd undertone that I could just barely make out, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I don't know what it was, but I know it was there. Finally my bus comes. I get on and I'm the only one there. All of a sudden I hear "Hey." I glance up and there's a little girl who says, "Remember me?" She reminded me strangely of the woman I was speaking with at the bus stop, but younger. You could cut the tension with a knife, and when I got off I swear she watched me as the bus left. It was probably just a coincidence, but I'm certain that I was the only one on the bus when I got on. Honestly though, it still freaks me out a little bit today. Edit. Little girl probably wasn't the best phrase. She was most likely around 11-12. It's common for kids to ride the bus to or from school. I've posted this story before. When I lived in South Africa, I traveled a lot with a Christian missionary humanitarian aid worker. He handled the spiritual stuff. I tended to work more with the local, mostly Xhosa, people, helping them with non-spiritual issues. In July 2010, we went to a village in the middle of nowhere. As soon as we stepped out the truck, we knew something was wrong. We hadn't been able to contact our guy in the village all day, and there was no one around at all. Pete and I went from house to house, looking for, well, anyone, but everywhere was completely empty. Eventually, we saw a figure run around the corner of a building on the far side of the village. It was a young woman, stark naked, running straight for us. Her arms were flailing, and she was running with like an animal, occasionally dropping to all fours, then back on her feet. As she got closer, he told me to get back in the truck. Then he screamed at me to get in the truck. I'd seen this guy watch a Xhosa witch doctor burn a dozen chickens alive and not bat an eyelid. So when he lost his it, I knew it was serious. I closed the truck door as she reached us. She was covered in blood. There were cuts and slices all over her face, arms, and breasts. One of her ears was missing, I think. There was a lot of blood. Her teeth were bloody, and she had a look in her eye of absolute, untamed rage. The screeching sound she made is unlike anything I've heard before or since. I can still hear it so vividly in my mind. Looking into her face, seeing her wide psychotic eyes and gaping mouth as she made that unholy sound froze me in my seat. Pete had started the truck and already started reversing up the dirt track, but she followed. He turned the car, all the while she was scratching at the windows and metalwork, then sped off up the track. She followed us. She didn't keep up, obviously, but for a while I thought she was going to. I've never seen someone run that fast in bare feet. The journey back to our base town was almost silent. I spent most of it concentrating on the sound of my own breathing and the rumble of the road. I asked Pete what that was and what we should do. He said the girl was no doubt insane, had a psychotic break or something, but the locals would have immediately thought her possessed if she didn't kill herself. The other villagers were within days. He suggested they had gathered in one house for safety. I saw a lot of ducked up it in that country. TLDR. The Reavers from Firefly are real, and they live in rural South Africa. This is the edit I made to clarify some things. For those of you who asked, here is some more information. 1. This happened in the Eastern Cape. which I would argue is the darkest, wildest, and most bizarre part of the country. Strange things happen there a lot, and often just get buried or picked up by one of the crazy tabloids like the Mercury, and subsequently ignored or written off. There are vast swathes of grassland punctuated by the odd settlement, without any adequate law enforcement. A lot of people live in these isolated settlements, and will only leave to work, or to get food. Many spend their whole lives in the village of their ancestors, as do their children, and so on. 2. Yes, we called the police, or rather Pete did. The officer said we will look into it. We never heard about it again. South Africa has some very developed, civilized, westernized areas, the major towns and cities, for example, but there are enormous parts of this country which have remained almost untouched for decades. The further you go from Joburg, or Cape Town, or even East London, our nearest city, the more rural and strange things can become. I'm not saying that all of rural South Africa is like this. A lot of the villages we went to were nice, simple settlements where the people welcomed us, gave us food, gawped at us for being white and so on. Some were more sinister. 3. We eventually got in touch with our guy. A day later, Pete asked him if everything was alright. He said we had a bad presence in the village. It is now gone. I don't know for sure what happened, but I can guess. Based on what Pete said, Pete's been back once since, without me, and they seemed fine. He told me he didn't ask about the girl, as he didn't know what had happened, and he didn't want them to react. I don't think he wanted to know. 3. This incident was by far the weirdest thing that happened to me there. The other duck puppet I mentioned didn't come close. It was just the kind of thing you wouldn't see in the West. I mentioned the Corsa Sangoma burning chickens alive. I'd seen people breeding housefuls of dogs, literally cramming shacks full of these pavement specials. I've seen young girls carry guns to school to defend themselves against rapists. There's a popular myth in SA that having sex with a virgin will make you immune to AIDS. I've seen the Corsa coming of age ritual, survival in the bush, then circumcision. I traveled to a village which preserved some of its elders by perching their bodies in a tree just outside the town, and so on. Lots of bizarre things with witch doctors. Lots of bone-chilling stories from other aid workers in the area. Nothing matches the Reaver girl, but still unusual and a bit unnerving for me. Some of my more boring stories include twice being caught in a riptide and sucked out to sea, having to identify the body of someone I'd never met, cramming 5 big African mamas in my tiny bakkie for a 40-kilometer trip, seeing my Corsa friend's 85-year-old mother-in-law physically hurl an adult goat into a carrel, and seeing my friend shoot a large fish at close range with a 30-06 rifle. 4. A couple of people have told me I'm a horrible human being or words to that effect for not helping this woman. I have a couple of reasons why I didn't do anything. The AIDS rate in SA is very high. If I touched this woman's blood, which was all over her, I could well have contracted the disease. Touching blood in Africa is a really bad idea. Secondly, she was quite clearly psychotic, possibly rabid. Someone commented, she was trying to kill us. I don't think my description did justice to the sheer ferocity of her movements. She was clawing at the windows, flailing against the door, scrabbling at the metal. She was genuinely trying to kill us with her bare hands. I was scared out of my mind. I grew up in a quiet little town in England. I'd never seen anything like this in real life. When I met Pete, I agreed to do whatever he told me when we were in the villages. For the good of my own safety, we did what we could. We got out of there. We called the police. We are not bad people, just unwilling to be eaten alive, or contract AIDS or whatever. I love South Africa, the Eastern Cape in particular. It is the place I love the most in the world. It's beautiful. It's fascinating. The people are generally lovely, and the food is brilliant. The mix of cultures, languages, peoples, and lifestyles is one of the most diverse in the world, and I count my time there among the greatest things I've ever done in my life. It can be scary, but then so can anywhere. My mom just recently told me the story of her friend's creepy dad. One night when she was younger she stayed over at this friend's house. Friend's creepy dad offered them fresh venison for dinner. Mom had never had venison, but of course ate it as not to be rude. Friend later tells mom that her dad is not a hunter. Years later we learned that creepy dad had murdered and cannibalized several women over the course of his life. Mom is pretty sure she ate human meat. My wife had a parasite in her abdomen for almost a year. They ended up having to cut it out of her and now it lives with us and I'm responsible for feeding it. Then it happened 2 more times. Creepiest thing I remember ever happening to me didn't involve paranormal things. I was walking to the store late at night, probably around 11 to 1 am, don't remember, but the streets were isolated. I live in the Bronx in a not so safe area, but I've grown up around the not so nice people in this neighborhood all my life to not be afraid that anything will happen to me, since a lot of them actually look out for their neighbors. They still aren't nice people to others, but I digress. While I was walking, the streets were completely empty until I heard footsteps behind me. Being the cautious person that I am, I turned around to take a good look at the man for a long minute just in case I had to identify him later. Growing up in an unsafe place, this is typically my line of thinking. Being that I'm a short girl, 5'1", and this man was twice my height, I was a bit creeped out but kept walking like normal. After a while he caught up to me and asked if I was Dominique, and I sternly said yes and kept walking. He then asked if I was 18. This was 3 years ago. At the time I was 17, and I replied no and was ready to cross the street because he was freaking me out. As soon as I said no, he looked at me disappointed and said oh never mind then and ran away from me. It was such a small thing, but it really creeped me out thinking about what may have happened if I had told him I was 18 and what exactly this guy was planning. A few years ago when my grandpa was really sick, me and my family were around his bed all saying our last words to him. Things were going normal, as we were all crying and saying goodbye. A little later his breaths were getting less and less frequent and we knew he was about to go. But on his last breath his eyes opened up really wide, he smiled, looking the happiest he had in years, and then he was just gone. To this day I still can't imagine what he felt. My boyfriend works night shift, and I was asleep alone in the house. I get woken up in the middle of the night by my puppy whining in the living room, and I assume it's because he wants outside. I'm just about to open the back door when I hear this weird scratching clicking sound at the front door, like someone was sticking something in the lock. I go to check, and I can see the silhouette of somebody standing there through the window in the door. I then notice there is a second figure in the living room window, although it's too dark to make out any features. I know they can see me because I didn't have any blinds at this point, and they just stood there. I totally freaked and called the cops. Then my dad. I huddled in the kitchen out of sight of any windows and waited for someone to come. My parents live across town and showed up before the cops. They were gone at this point, but the neighbors across the street were up and saw the car. I ended up staying at my parents' place that night, and when I came home the next morning, I noticed the basement window was partially kicked in. I got a security system installed the next day. I still have no idea who it was. Kidnapping attempt in the 1980s. Sacramento neighborhood late at night. Visiting a friend when I was maybe 9-10 years old. 3 of us walk out to go play at this park elementary school several blocks away at around 10 p.m. at night. We were playing frisbee in the street in front of the school and our frisbee lands in the street as a white van pulls up and stops, as if to allow us to get our frisbee. I walk toward the van and grab the frisbee, then move to the side to allow the van to pass. As the van passed, the sliding door opened and a guy dressed in black like a ninja came flying out and tried to grab me. He had a harness on and the van had been rigged with a telescoping mechanism that allowed him to come out around 5 feet while hanging from this harness, like they do in some haunted houses where people appear to be flying, and it was operated by another person inside, also dressed in black. So there was at least 3 people involved in this attempt. I barely dodged his attempt to grab me and all 3 of us ran toward the elementary school and hopped the fence, about 6 feet tall, ran along the fence low bushes and then hopped a second fence, about 15 feet maybe, that allowed us to be inside the school. He was scared as hell and could hear the van driving around and assumed they were in hot pursuit. We found a way to get onto the roof of the school from inside, thank God, and proceeded to observe the van driving around the school for at least 30 minutes in an obvious attempt to find us. This scared us even more because one would think the would-be kidnappers would flee, but I suppose they thought we could identify them. This was before cell phones, so we stayed up there until around 45 minutes after we last saw them. It appeared that some of them were searching for us on foot also, which added to the fear. We eventually escaped and went back to my friend's house, and never told anyone in our family out of fear of being punished.